Hello again, photo friends. Today we're going to be talking about the exposure triangle so we can get really good exposed high quality images. So our objectives are understand the camera modes and its functions, demonstrate knowledge of the exposure triangle and how to control exposure in your camera. And our first words worth knowing is the exposure triangle. So it's a term used to describe the three fundamentals of exposure: aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. When you change one of the elements on that triangle, you must change at least one of the other to keep your exposure correct. So we'll be talking all about that little triangle right now. So how to have properly exposed images. So like I just said before, these three things work together to create a properly exposed image. So I like to pick the ISO and then pick an aperture, adjust the shutter. But if you change one in that little equation, you have to change the other. And each of those things will change how something else looks in your photograph. So the first thing I like to start with is always pick your ISO. So this affects what's known as the amount of noise in your photos. So if you know your photos are like really gritty, especially like you try to take one like on an iPhone at night and it's like, why are there all these little dots in there? That's noise. So it's equivalent to what film speed was, but it controls the amount of light needed to make an image. So the higher that number, the less light the camera needs to make an image. So if you're all the way over here on 3200, the camera doesn't need as much light to take an image. You can take images in darker areas, but the trade-off is you're going to have that grittiness to it. On the other side, if you have an ISO 100, you would use that in a very bright, like super sunny. You're not going to have any of that grit, but you need a super bright area to use an ISO 100. So you need to depend on the lighting outside. First, pick your ISO. Second is shutter speed. So shutter speed is going to affect the appearance of motion, and it's how quickly the shutter opens and closes. So it's the click of the camera. So it's like kind of also think of it as a timer, and it's in fractions of a second. So if you're looking at your shutter speed on the back of your camera, it's in fractions of a second. So 1/60 is a 60th of a second. So the smaller that fraction, so think about back when you were like in third grade and did the pizza fractions, the smaller that fraction, the less the amount of time the shutter's open. So if it's a 2,000th of a second, that is way faster than a 60th of a second or a quarter of a second. The trade-off with this is the slower your shutter speed is. So if you're looking at that pinwheel down there, the slower the shutter speed is, the more time whatever's moving in your photo has to move, and it almost draws on your image sensor. If you have a really fast shutter speed and someone's jumping, boom, it just caught it, they're up in the air, it's a split second. So shutter speed affects the appearance of motion. Last is your aperture. So aperture is going to affect the amount of focus that's in your image overall. So it's the size of the opening in the lens. So you can have a really small opening or you can have a really large opening. So it's controlling the intensity of the light, whether it's a small opening or a large opening. And the larger numbers here is a smaller amount of light or opening in the lens. I know it's kind of weird, but f/22, it all goes back to fractions and things. f/22, you can see down there, the flowers in the front are in focus and the background's pretty, not super sharp, but the background's sharp. That also has more other things we're going to talk about later. So then if you're at f/16, it gets a little bit more blurry in the background. 5.6 to 4, f/2.8, f/1.8, the background's completely blurred. So the camera's focused on the flower. Depending on the aperture, how much focus are you going to get in the background? So, and you also need to think, if you want a really small aperture, you want everything in focus, you're going to need to balance that out. You're going to need to give it more light with your shutter. So it's a little balancing act of how much light you give it here. You need to balance it with light over here. So again, our ISO triangle, we're going to pick our ISO. So if it's super sunny out, we're going to pick ISO 100, 200, 400. Then we need to decide what is our focus. So if we're photographing a soccer game, we want a fast shutter speed to capture the motion. We're going to have to compensate with more light coming in through the aperture. So we're going to have a wider aperture. We'll get onto this when we start shooting, but I just want you to know when you change one thing, you have to balance out your equation. How do you know, like, I don't know how am I going to balance it out? You have what's called a light meter. The light meter is right here. It's essentially a little number line. And then depending on your setting, you can control how it looks. So if we're at the minus, we're giving it less light. Your photo is going to be overall darker. If it's on the plus, you're going to be giving it more light. And each one of these is it's a step. So this is 1 step less light, 2 steps less light, 3 steps less light, and then so on. You can also over or underexpose your photo for your own creative effect. So just because it says it's in the middle here, maybe it still looks too bright to you, give it a step less. So this is all stuff that we'll learn as we start shooting in class. So the light meter is that internal device, and it's just averaging the light. So it's not always right. It's generally, I'd say 90% of the time it's right. But if you have an area that's like really bright, it might affect it and give you a little bit wonky reading. So you still need to use your eyes and look at the photo and make sure it's what you want. You have to be able to read this. I will ask you, what's your light meter on? So make sure you know how to read it. And it's right there. All right, last is our camera modes. You got to understand how to use your camera. You got to know what those little buttons are, right? So A+ on a Canon, if you have a Fuji or a Nikon, it might be different. It's called Scene Intelligent Auto. So this is completely automatic. You're not doing any of the work. The camera's analyzing the scene. It's saying, oh, this looks like a portrait, and it's going to set the settings that it thinks are good for a portrait. I'm not a fan, but if you're just getting started and you just want to practice composition, this might be a good place to start. Program is automatic, but it allows you to adjust things. So you're going to pick the ISO, and then you can change combinations of the f-stop and shutter speed by moving the wheel up here. So you just kind of move it around, and you can see your settings back here. So you can move it around and I don't really like that. I can move it. It's going to balance your exposure, but you can kind of change the settings a little bit. Whereas the A+, it's doing everything for you. So there's semi-automatic. These are the ones that I kind of like to use. So TV is shutter priority. So you're going to pick your ISO. You're going to pick your shutter speed. I know I'm shooting sports. I want a fast shutter speed. And then so as I'm going, I'm like, all right, I want to shoot at 500th of a second. The camera's going to do the correct aperture. So it's going to balance that equation for me. Aperture priority is the opposite. This is what I like to shoot on a lot. So I'm going to pick the aperture. I know I want blurry background. I'm going to be f2.8. The camera is going to adjust the shutter speed for me. However, with these, there's a button, and it's on the back over here. We'll talk about that later, called exposure compensation. This is, again, something I use frequently. So let's say I'm on aperture priority, but I'm like, this looks too light. I'm going to press this button. I'm going to tell the camera, I want you to make this 2 stops darker than what you think. And then as I shoot, it's going to automatically make every photo 2 stops darker than what the camera thinks. So you can also override this and still be creative and still controlling the camera. This is just faster. If you're shooting something that's moving fast, this is a bit faster. And last is manual. So manual is like driving a manual transmission car. You're controlling everything. So you have to be looking at the light meter at all times to kind of see where it is. So you have to press the button, you have to look, you have to press the other button to move the aperture, and you have to look at your meter. So this is slower. So you want to learn how to do this. You want to be able to do this. But if you're doing in a situation where you got to think fast, this might not be your first choice. Again, you have to use the light meter. Whew, that was a lot, wasn't it? All right, so complete your notebook activity, and I'll help you with that if you need to, and check off with me when finished, and I can't wait to get started taking some photos. Good job, guys.